Good afternoon and welcome to OAG's webinar today. This is the second one we're doing today. With this morning we did something quite similar but with a bit more of an Asia Pacific slant, and today we're going to be talking a bit more about the Americas and Europe. Our title today is From Zero to Hero, so successful network experimentation by airlines through COVID. So this came about because the last webinar in January, we had Finnair's Mikko Titinen, and he was talking about Finnair and some of the things they're doing out of Stockholm with their A350s and some long haul services. And we thought it'd be good to have a look at how different airlines are adapting their network strategies for the new operating environment and how they're exploiting weaknesses where they see them. So we're going to walk you through a number of examples today, and we're going to have a general discussion about where aviation's at. My name is Becca Rowland and I'll be hosting. I'm a partner at Midas Aviation, and with me today I've got John Grant, who's our usual guest. He's Chief Analyst at OAG, well known as a commentator on the industry. Welcome, John.
Hi everyone. Hello Becca, thanks for inviting me. Good to be here.
They're not bored of you yet then? We're still getting lots of listeners. They're not bored of listening.
Well, they may be, but they have even less to do. So thanks for joining, everyone.
Great, and it's good to have Peter Hoslin back with us as well. Peter's joined us, I think, once before, haven't you? And you've got a long history in aviation, and you work now with airports and tourism bodies on their strategies. So well suited for our discussion today. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Thanks, Becca. Good to be with you both once again, and hello to everybody.
Great. Okay. Let's start as we usually do before we move on to the strategy that airlines are taking, with a bit of a roundup of where we're at today with the industry. So the first slide here is looking at capacity, so that's seats, each month for the last 12 months versus the same month in 2019. And we pull out China separately because we keep getting asked, can we separate China from the rest of Asia, because its pattern is quite different. So that's what we've got here. John, do you want to talk us through this? What are the salient points for this month?
Yeah, sure, Becca. So I guess the most important thing is that we're now back above 80 million scheduled seats a week. Across all of the regional markets, which is still about 24-25 percentage points below pre-COVID levels, just to put it in context, but it has been moving in the right direction in the last couple of weeks. And I think importantly, we're beginning to see some of those regions where that were really stuck in the mud and not moving, beginning to recover, most noticeably Southwest Pacific, where the announcement that Australia will reopen for international travellers from the 21st of the month, which is next Monday, is a welcome development, slightly surprising, caught many airlines off guard, but good news. And Vietnam is reopening. There's been considerable capacity growth in Western Europe in the last few weeks, with both the United Kingdom and more recently France easing their travel requirements, and in the case of the UK actually waiving, I think, nearly every requirement. And when we see something like that happen, it has a sort of like a triangular effect in Europe. So you see the UK increase, but the capacity is going to Italy, it's going to Germany and Spain. So you see corresponding increases in capacity in those markets as well. So we're heading in the right direction, no doubt about that. We've got another 5-6 weeks before the winter seasons end, and we go back to the IATA summer programs, when we should begin to see a lot more capacity being added back. But if we can continue to pass through the Omicron variant around the world, and our next slide speaks to how quickly it happens and what we can do about it, then I think we're in a really good space for the summer. Strong pent-up demand. Yeah, it's going to be a good summer for airlines, I hope.
Yeah, and these dotted lines we see to the right of our chart are the capacity for the next month. So it's not completely fixed, is it? We do it as dotted because it's not actually happened yet. But that's all looking pretty positive, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. We typically, on a rolling 3-month basis are seeing around 7 to 8 million seats being taken out per week. And I know, that sounds a lot, and it is a lot, but it is only about 1% of the planned capacity for that period of time. So we're seeing a lot more airlines with stable networks, with fewer schedule changes, and they're not cutting capacity. And we just generally seem to be in a better place. Airlines have resourced as best they can during the Omicron variant. They've had their own crewing and rostering issues that they've had to face and resources, but we seem to be heading on the right side of the curve. We're not going to get back to 2019 levels by the end of this year in terms of capacity, and indeed we may never get back to some of the demand levels we saw in 2019, which I think you've said before, Becca, seems like it may have been a golden year for the industry. But I guess with the buoyancy and the growth in the market, it's the econometric factors around that are now beginning to cause some concern, not least of which, of course, will be the price of oil, which is not creeping up, it's going through the roof, climbing faster than an A340. And that's a worry for us when we're trying to stimulate demand through the airlines. Price elasticity with all of the other increases we're seeing in cost of living throughout Western Europe and North America will be an issue for airlines, that's for sure.
Yeah, I know. When we have our discussions amongst ourselves, I'm probably more negative about how soon some sort of recovery towards 2019 levels will come, and I think the fuel price just is one more factor that will suppress the ability of the industry to recover. Let's have a look at some individual countries. So this is for each week this year, and again it shows the comparison of capacity with the same week in 2019. And the dark green, we've sort of used the color coding. The darker green shows where it's further off from the 2019 levels. So Thailand, of these countries, which are the top 20 by capacity last week, Thailand's the furthest behind. We've got a question in, so if you want to ask questions, please use the chat and the area, and we can try and take the questions as we go through. So our first question is, what's happening in North America with an 11% drop, which is what we just showed. Here we've got the USA at the top with 9.5%. That's a bit worse than where it was, isn't it, John? But actually, overall, we've seen the US doing pretty well, haven't we?
It has, and we see it at this time of the year. Sometimes week-on-week comparisons can be really difficult because of seasonal holidays. Silly things like Easter, a movable public holiday, can have a significant impact in a market like North America. And you have some very large carriers in the US, people like Allegiant, Frontier, who we'll come on to talk about, and Spirit, who are very good at putting capacity rapidly in and rapidly out. To a point where sometimes they can, in a space of 3 weeks, change their capacity by 30 or 40%, and then 3 or 4 weeks later put it back in. And that's just them being very effective and having very sharp power by the hour type lease agreements on the aircraft. So they know exactly what their operating costs are, and they manage capacity accordingly. It is a fascinating way that they run some of their airlines.
Peter, let's bring you in at this point. When you see these numbers, how are you sort of seeing the future, the next weeks and months? I'm thinking particularly in terms of the sort of reduction in travel restrictions or changes in travel restrictions. How's that going to affect demand, and what are we going to see with how airlines are going to respond?
Well, that's the be all and end all issue for especially European travel, but of course in Australia as well, where you see the border restrictions, the entry restrictions, and the relative ease of being able to take flights on a reasonably regular basis in a fairly pain-free and hopefully lower cost environment is what it's all about. And I'm getting quite positive signals from out of Europe, in Germany and Austria, with the online bookings for early summer. Q2 and spring, where there's quite positive forward bookings, and not only for intra-Europe, but also into warmer spots for Europeans to be able to get to. And I think in particular, the UAE seems to be a bit of a hotspot. So I get a sense that there's some good optimism within the travel trade environment. Capacity is always going to be an issue about getting the right flights. The airlines are doing quite well in maximizing their load factors, but that is all about how easy the governments are making it to get on and off the flights. It's been steadily improving, and it's becoming a little bit more normalized to be able to get to the airport and get on board quite easily and smoothly with the right documentation. So overall, it's looking quite positive.
Sorry, Peter, go on.
Go ahead.
I was going to say it is interesting how a government can influence and impact capacity. And there was a question here from Nigel that sort of plays to that. He was saying, why does India move so much? And that is all about a couple of spikes in Omicron outbreaks in various major cities, and the government shuts the whole city down and capacity is closed out. And you can see that's happened in China for a few weeks before the Olympics. And we can't underestimate that even as we build back out, and to Peter's point, governments will be absolutely controlling what can and cannot be done. And that will subsequently end up in situations where, you know, capacity hopefully will continue to grow, but it may drop at short notice.
I think what's interesting about the India numbers here is just how fast capacity fell, but then it's come back again. The airlines and the industry seem better able to respond rapidly, and then in both, you know, the downward and the upward direction. And so, you know, we've spoken about Omicron sort of passing through much more quickly than the other waves, and it doesn't seem to rock the industry, or this one hasn't, in the same way that earlier waves of COVID have.
No, and you know, they've got some very well managed and very effective low cost carriers in Indigo and SpiceJet, and you know, they are the equivalent of Ryanair. They will turn on and turn off the tap of capacity as required.
Yeah, I think the low cost airlines have always been very nimble with this type of on and off of capacity. I think COVID has also driven a lot more flexibility and quicker response from the legacies. Similarly, turning on and off and being prepared to put up with some disruptions to save capacity and manage some of their load factors. And it's also going to be very important to be watching the inflation in Europe now. There's a lot more focus on the fact that cost of living is actually going up quite appreciably, and it's driven by the scares over a lot of the oil and the gas fueling the cost of living worries in Europe. So at the moment, I don't think that's enough to deflect traffic in the near term, but it is going to be an increasing factor. So as long as I think we get the capacity, the airlines keep their pricing to attract people onto them, which they're all doing, with any luck, we can overcome the cost of living increases that are going on around Europe and most of the world.
There was an interesting observation in this morning's webinar, commenting particularly about India, but I think the same may be true elsewhere, that actually over the last 2 years we've seen a very large drop in the size of the middle class population, and that as well, if we see the economic effect ripple through so that there's just the middle class, which has driven a lot of this travel, shrinks, then that's going to have a bit of an impact, isn't it, as well?
Yeah, especially India and Indonesia have been hit by that significantly. Less so China. The government, I think, have been able to manage that a little bit better. But of course, we're not seeing what their real propensity to travel is, because they're internationally still effectively closed. But India and Indonesia have seen a huge impact on their middle class travelers.
I mean, I think China at the moment is at just 1% of all of their capacity is on international flights to and from the country. You know, and that was I think about 10 or 11% in 2019. So it's a significant change. But I think, you know, when we talk about the risk and all of those other econometric factors that probably are casting a little shadow of doubt over the resilience of the long-term market recovery, let's not forget there are lots of people out there who've been saving and you know, are about to revenge spend on a trip to somewhere and take knock some things off their bucket list. We've still got people who've got airline vouchers from 2020 that they're trying to cash in. So I think demand is going to be really strong in the peak months of this year. And you know, if you haven't booked your flight to Spain, or you haven't booked your flight to the Caribbean if you're in North America for the summer, I'd urge you to get on and do it quickly before you're paying a very expensive fare.
Yeah. Okay, that's
And
really great.
Thailand, you'll be looking forward to that too when you look at those numbers.
I'm sure. Let's have a look at some of those strategies now that we talked about. So when we've sort of discussed amongst ourselves, we've come up with a list of all sorts of things we're seeing in the marketplace, and we've listed I think most of those here under different headings and provided some examples. And we're going to not necessarily talk about all of these, but we'll talk through some of them. So network experimentation, we're certainly seeing things like legacy carriers operating seasonal leisure markets, new routes, we will be looking at that. We've seen lots and lots of new routes in Europe in particular. Hub breach, so you know, just the presence of low-cost carriers in some of the hubs where they didn't used to be quite so big. It's not massive, but definitely seeing a bit more presence in the US of some of the low-cost carriers at the big hubs. And we'll look at that. Hub bypass, so where we're seeing airlines change the way they fly so that they don't go through the hub. And the example we've got here is Qantas flying direct to India, which it used to do about 10 years ago, rather than going through Singapore. So we'll have a look at that. Hub strengthening, we had a long chat this morning about Singapore Airlines. So if you're interested in that, then I would urge you to listen to the webinar again that we put out this morning. Market share grab, that's again a Europe story in many ways about Ryanair, and we'll have a look at that. Finnair, which I've already mentioned, exploiting that competitor weakness and putting new routes in. There's airline startups, there's mergers, there's diversification. So yeah, again, the AirAsia one of actually moving perhaps away from defining yourself as an airline, we discussed this morning in the webinar. So that's one to listen to on the webinar from this morning. But let's start with having a look at mergers. We've got a high-profile merger announced in the last week, Frontier and Spirit. This chart shows the route networks of both, and the grey lines, if you can see them, are those routes that they both operate. So not a lot of overlap, even though they're quite similar networks, aren't they, John?
Yeah, it's an interesting development, and I think one that's good for both of them. The combined entity will become the 5th largest carrier in the United States. It will create some distance for itself from the other carriers who are in that sort of second tier. So, you know, it's going to move away from Allegiant, and it's going to move away from some of the smaller regional carriers. And the two airlines have the same aircraft fleet. They've got a lot of commonality. You know, it makes sense. And of course, the one thing they've got to do is to be able to actually deliver on the business synergies that they've talked about. You know, most mergers are, the real payback is in the devil is in the detail of cost cutting, of joint purchasing, you know, effective use of resources, better use of handling facilities, all of these sort of things, you know, driving your utilization up where you can. So I think this will go through. I'd be surprised if the regulator rejected this and said that it couldn't go through. And I know there's been comparison with JetBlue and American Airlines partnership on the East Coast, but this is a much broader network, and it's designed to achieve different things. So yeah, good luck to them.
So they've got quite a lot of aircraft on order, haven't they? Is that an issue? That how do you integrate that many aircraft, and does it give them too much capacity? How do you manage costs in that sort of environment?
Well, they have, the two companies have very different fleet strategies and ownership strategies. So I understand Frontier have a much higher proportion of their aircraft that are leased and powered by the hour. So that, you know, there is going to be flexibility within all of these things for them to renegotiate how many aircraft they do actually end up with, adjust their delivery schedules off the production lines for new aircraft. There's not going to be a shortage of other airlines who's going to, you know, be available and want to step into some of those delivery positions if they become available. So it's a matter of sitting down and working out the finer details now. And I think they'll be fine, Becca. You know, they both have strong brands. I wouldn't say that both of them are high in terms of customer appreciation. You know, but they fulfill a need in the US market, and they both have done it well over the years.
So we
I think there's quite a bit of synergies coming out of this. So it's really great to see these two carriers going down the merger path, I think, in that they've immediately seen they've got a very similar fleet potential, the Airbus fleet. They both got a strong focus on Miami and Florida. And it's how they then take those new deliveries that are coming up, and when, or if, as you said, John, as well, and where they start to put them. And I'm interested in particular to see how Frontier will use their A321 XLRs. That's not out there really yet, and it'll be interesting to see if that forms a part of this future and when.
Yeah. So what we've shown here is 2 points in time, February 3 years ago and this February. Each of the airlines sort of represented in a sort of three-dimensional way, but you can see Frontier and Spirit down in the bottom left corner. The merger doesn't take them up to near the size of the big carriers, does it? It's going to sit somewhere between this cluster on the left and the cluster on the right.
Absolutely, and you know, one of the noticeable things, as we know through COVID-19, is that those airlines who had a large reliance on international travel suffered more than those that had a large domestic market presence. Spirit and Frontier do have some international services down into the Caribbean, but you could even argue they're nearly domestic services, and Spirit have a service down to Lima, which is emotional, I think is the word I would use. I'm not sure it's completely profitable, but for both of them, you know, they're essentially domestic carriers, and they're going to still be playing in the domestic market. And as long as they can keep their cost under control, as I say, I think they've got an opportunity to get further away from some of the others that they've been competing with, and really shouldn't be too much of a distraction for the Southwest and the Deltas and the Uniteds, you know, who are still well clear of them in terms of size and scale.
So why haven't we seen more mergers over the last couple of years? We've often talked about the fact that we've not seen as many airline failures, but we've really only seen Korean and Asiana merge until now, haven't we? So are there others out there that we should be looking to where we might see mergers?
I don't think so. I mean, you know, Wizz Air made a preemptive attempt on EasyJet last autumn, and that was rebuffed. But I don't really personally see that there's much benefit apart from this one to be played out anywhere really. You know, there's many airlines who have managed to survive, many with the support and assistance of their governments. And they've got big debts to pay back. And as you know, as I've said before, if you think it's worth buying an airline, well, at the moment, it's probably easier to start your own airline. If that is the case, then you can probably do it more effectively and quicker than you could by doing due diligence on an existing airline and deciding at the end of it you don't like that. And to Rodolfo's point here, Air Europa and Iberia / IAG is a classic case. You know, 2019 / 20, it may have made a bit of sense. At the end of the pandemic, it makes absolutely no sense for IAG to be going through with the purchase of Air Europa. Peter, have you got any whiff of any potential mergers?
No. And as you said, the Wizz preemptive bid on EasyJet was probably a bit speculative, but you can see that Wizz and their big backers with Indigo are really still very clearly focused on their existing strategies, and the fact that Indigo are part of the Frontier merger with Spirit. So no, I'm not seeing anything else.
Interesting. Okay, let's stick with the US market. And one of the sort of strategies we're seeing that I mentioned at the beginning was sort of hub breaches. So the low-cost carriers making greater inroads at some of these major hubs. So we picked out some of the US hubs here and some of the low-cost carriers and showing where they're at now in terms of the share of capacity. They're not huge numbers, they're not dominating anywhere, but those market shares have generally crept up. Are we going to see more of that, John, or is this just something that could happen while capacity was suppressed a bit? Or
I think we will. The low-cost carriers will, where possible, seek to gain bigger share in all of the major hub markets, and I think that's just good business sense for them. There is established markets there. They can get a share of the point-to-point market. Their scheduling can be very flexible compared to some of the network carriers who are waiting for connecting flows and operate classic hub and spoke services. And for the airlines, for the airports, it makes complete sense. I mean, if anyone has been at Miami after an American Airlines wave of services have left on their hubs and spokes, then the ramp used to be deserted. So for Spirit to come in and drive a load of aircraft down from Fort Lauderdale and put them into Miami makes a lot of sense for the airport. It makes a lot of sense for the airline, and everyone's a winner. I think that's the same in Los Angeles, where there's been some shift. It's just the way it is, and it's good for competition. It's the sort of thing we should see, Becca. It would be fascinating if Ryanair could ever achieve a 7% capacity share at London Heathrow, when you think British Airways only have about a 53% share. What carnage could Ryanair create for BA, out of a low-cost terminal, or even out of a hangar at Heathrow if they could?
Yeah, we had tried to have a look at a few examples in Europe, but didn't see quite the same. We couldn't come up with quite as compelling a picture as we're painting here for the US. Interesting. Let's move across to Europe, though. Lots of new routes. There's been a lot of talk about all the new routes that we've seen in Europe. What we're showing on the chart here is just the number of routes operated from European airports over the last 2 years. And I was quite surprised how it goes up and down. I don't know if we went further back in time, if we'd see the same sort of seasonal ups and downs. But it was 20,000 2 years ago, and then peaked at 25,000 at the end of the summer. But down at 8,500 a year ago. So a lot of change in routes, isn't it? So it's not just new routes opening, but other routes being dropped, or them being just operated for a season, or what's happening here, John?
Yeah, I think we'll see a significant increase through to the summer, when a lot of the low frequency 1-2 per week low cost carrier type services begin to be operated from Central Europe to sunspots, from Scandinavia to sunspots, and even Eastern Europe. So I think it's going to improve. If we said 25,000 city pairs in September, excuse me, I think that could be 27 or 28.
Yeah, I think it's looking good for this year as well. And I think a lot of this variability in these new routes are also coming out of the nimbleness of the low-cost carriers. But I'm also getting a sense that the low-cost carriers in both Europe and in the States are taking the opportunity during COVID of being able to grab new route opportunities where they've probably had them on the back burner for many years of looking at the opportunity. And the risk is that much lower now, as everything is risky on routes. So they're taking new chances, giving things a go, and typically sticking at them as well. And whereas the legacy carriers, particularly in Europe, are not always sticking to their experimentation of routes and pulling capacity quite quickly. So I think the LCC carriers are trying and sticking to new route opportunities. Of course, they're dropping some of them, but I think they're a lot more committed and they're finding it's working for them better now. And the legacy carriers are not really as committed to these new route opportunities. And the point-to-point elements that low-cost carriers can bring, give them the opportunity to do that.
And how much of this is being driven by changes in what passengers want? That, you know, I was listening to something yesterday talking about people wanting to travel, you know, more to coastal regions or less densely populated destinations. Is some of this about the passenger changing, or is it just experimentation, having a go at routes that they've thought about for a long time?
I think it's experimentation, Becca. I think, you know, we've seen this historically, haven't we, where low-cost airlines can create a market out of nothing. We've done lots of work around rates of market stimulation when a service is, or a pair is served indirectly, and suddenly a carrier comes on, and you can see the market increase by 300 or 400% depending upon its original size. So, you know, I think price stimulates a lot of activity. I think the only flag I have about this summer and how many airport pairs we will end up will be just the price of oil and whether it makes it too expensive for some of those sectors. You know, the elasticity of demand from those regional routes has got to be pretty strong if they're going to be sustainable.
Yeah, for sure.
I think there's been quite a lot of domestic activity, presumably within these stats as well. So including domestic, it's been extraordinary to see what's been going on in Italy during COVID. So as Air Italy and Ernest collapsed and Alitalia were in disarray, Ryanair, Wizz Air moving in and trying different city pairs, both domestic Italy and also international in and out of Italy to other Europe, has been strong. Similarly in Spain and also Scandinavia. You know, it hasn't always been positive, but we've seen Wizz try the domestic market in Norway and pull back. So I think domestic has been given the airlines quite a few opportunities within these big variables as well.
Yeah, and not surprising given that it's just been easier to travel, hasn't it, domestically? So, yeah.
And thinking of just the previous slide on where we had hub breach, an interesting example in Europe has been Arlanda, where Stockholm's major airport has attracted Ryanair. They've moved from Stockholm Skavsta up to Arlanda, and they've now Norwegian has just decided to go back into Arlanda. Eurowings is committed to make Arlanda a base, and in the past the low-cost carriers were a tiny proportion. It'd be interesting to see what their new statistics will be for LCC, but it's going to be quite an interesting, significant change to the hub, a bit like Vienna over a couple of years ago when they had a massive boost in low-cost carrier share.
Yeah.
Interesting comment here, Becca, from Rodolfo, who says, how reliable is someone like Wizz who turns routes on and off like a light switch? And I would respond and say, actually, they're very reliable. Because if the market doesn't turn up, they'll go. You know, and you can't be more reliable than that, Rodolfo.
Actually, the next slide we've got, after this one, we've got some numbers for Wizz. But before that, this just looks at the low-cost share by region. And what we see is for Europe, low-cost carriers have gained 8 percentage points over the last two or 3 years, I guess. So that's massive, isn't it, John? I mean, I think we're seeing now low-cost carriers with, it's certainly over a third of capacity, which probably puts them at 45% of traffic, doesn't it, in Europe?
It does, and it's almost been sort of under the radar as we've all worried about the pandemic and what's happening, and who's doing what, when are we all going to be locked down, and it just is testament to how sharp, how effective the low-cost carriers have been in restarting and reigniting their networks compared to legacy carriers. They're in the last 10 meters of a 100-meter sprint, while most of the legacy carriers are still getting off the blocks. They've done a really, really good job. And even in those markets where we see what looks like less low-cost carrier share at the moment, such as the Southwest Pacific, well, that's purely because the domestic Australian market has been closed. With the announcements in the last couple of weeks, and if Western Australia ever decides it wants to join Australia once again and allow travel, that situation will change. So I think it's going to be a change. It's a step change that we will not go back from. Low-cost carriers are going to dominate the point-to-point currently regional markets in which they trade. But they're spreading their wings. Some of them are moving into the Middle East. One of them is trying some transatlantic activity this summer again. They will start to think about doing some medium range, long haul type sort of stuff in the next couple of years when they get their XLR variants, be they 737 or 320s.
Yeah, there's space for the what we call legacy carriers, but actually the low-cost carriers have mostly been around for quite a long time now as well. The space for those legacy carriers is being squeezed again, isn't it?
Yeah, and what used to be the premium corporate market is not returned as quickly as we expected for very good reasons. It probably won't pay the same price as it used to. It certainly won't travel with the frequency it used to travel with. And companies are realizing that whilst they need to travel, they don't need to travel as frequently as they previously did. And that I think is a warning, and perhaps it's why British Airways have gone on a charm offensive in the last 2 weeks, with publicly bringing back free bottles of water on their domestic flights, etc. They realize that they've got to create some distance in what they offer to a low cost, otherwise they'll be toast.
I love the idea of a bottle of water, a plastic bottle of water, being the difference between a legacy and a low-cost carrier.
Yeah, exactly, a huge product differential. Yeah, a bottle of water.
Yeah, but I think also as well, the pandemic has I think lowered a lot of consumers' expectations of what they want from flying, from moving from a long, leisurely, luxurious, comfortable type travel experience to, I just want to get on the plane, get off as quick as I can, get in and out of my destination. And that reduces some of the differential between the low cost and the legacies.
Interesting. So our next slide shows just how well certainly one of the low-cost carriers in Europe has been doing. So at the top here, we've got capacity for EasyJet, Ryanair and Wizz Air, the 3 largest carriers. And we just show how the share of seats has changed over the last few years. Ryanair going from 10.5% of seats, departing seats from European airports, to 15.8. That's a massive increase, isn't it? So, even for all the churn that we've seen with Wizz Air, their share of the whole market isn't so different in terms of capacity to where it used to be, but certainly in terms of seats. But Ryanair's really gone for it, hasn't it?
Oh, it must be so frustrating to be a competitor of Ryanair's. However hard you think you're pedaling to catch up, they always seem to be getting further away. I think their planned aircraft orders this year work out at about 1 every 4 or 5 days. And there'll be some fleet replacement in there, but they're a well-oiled machine in every part of their business. Their CEO, creates wonderful sound bites and tells the truth, sometimes harshly, and people don't like to hear it. But ultimately, many of the things he says are absolutely true, and they lead the European market. And I think even legacy airline CEOs are great admirers of the Ryanair model and what it does. None of us enjoy the experience, but it fulfills a need, as Peter says.
And Wizz Air has been doing some extraordinary things over the last couple of years, and their innovations during COVID. When you come back and you see these results of how steadily Ryanair is still outpacing everyone is quite extraordinary. But I think what I like about Wizz Air's approach to COVID is grab opportunities, continue to grow. Yes, they've gone up and down in their capacity, so has Ryanair, but strong, steady, sticking to their strategy. But it is extraordinary to see this 15.8% for February, and presumably that'll continue on for a while.
Yeah,
and with so many more aircraft on order with the low-cost carriers than the legacy carriers, this discrepancies, it just drives home, doesn't it, how much more share the low-cost carriers will have.
Absolutely. I mean, this is what we're I think going to see more and more of. When you look and see how many new aircraft or orders there are amongst the top 10 low-cost airlines compared to legacy, we're looking at 50% more on the low-cost carrier side. We know their daily utilization, the number of flights they operate per day tends to be higher. So they're generating perhaps 4 round trips a day. They're getting 800 seats off each of those aircraft. Someone like China Southern might be getting 400 seats off those aircraft, 450. So their productivity is much higher as well. And that all goes, when you begin to put those multipliers together, they just keep going further and further into the market share that used to be with the legacy carriers.
Oh, so we could talk about low-cost carriers and strategies for ages, but we've got a few more slides to look at in terms of strategies that we're seeing or ways of operating that we're seeing amongst airlines. So I mentioned this earlier, Qantas bypassing Singapore, flying from Australia to India. Currently it's an operation from Adelaide, but I believe it's going to switch to Melbourne next month. So it's 10 years since they were flying direct, and I guess in some ways, why did they stop? This is quite a logical thing, isn't it, John? That the market between Singapore and India is quite full of low-cost carriers, and it just makes it even without COVID and the pandemic and all the disruption, it's probably a harder sell to fly via Singapore on Qantas, isn't it?
Well, on Qantas or on SQ to SQ or MH to MH, whatever it happened to be, the level of complexity we've now created for those 6 freedom flows from this market to Australia and back and forth means that for someone who was in the market to get back in, there is no better time if you've got the fleet and you have a broader strategy. The opportunity is there. It takes out many of the travel factors that people would have to think about when they're going back and forth. Large diaspora, as you note here. And as I said this morning, ultimately, an opportunity for a decent cricket team to go down to Australia and maybe beat the Aussies in their own backyard, which would be quite nice.
Chance of that, is there, John?
I don't know, Peter. I mean, you're in Austria. You can't say you're an Australian anymore.
I don't know. I can still keep an eye on what they're doing down there.
You can.
If someone can do it, it would be India.
Yeah, it is a fascinating development, but I think the whole Qantas story over the next couple of years will be quite exciting. A base in Darwin being established this week. 4 Embraer 190s being put there for domestic services, but also doing some stuff into Papua New Guinea. And when they get the 320 XLR, which will be coming along sooner than we realise, then suddenly secondary Southeast Asian markets that they couldn't serve with 380s or 767s, the seat cost will be so low. They'll be able to suck into those markets and begin to build some more traffic.
It's very clever strategy by Qantas over the years, I believe. The fact that they had the foresight 15, 20 years ago to set up Jetstar in Singapore and establish themselves there to be able to take advantage of the Southeast Asian boom and being able to connect into those markets allows them to do this and still take advantage of the Singapore or the Malaysian or even Thai intermediate hubs that they used to use for a lot of these long hauls. So if Qantas does go back into Rome, which they're planning to do later this year, they were going to go via Singapore, as they've done in the past. Now they're planning on Perth, Rome direct. And almost all of these are originating out of Sydney. So the Darwin London is coming out of Sydney initially, Perth to Rome, there will be others, but they're well covered by having their own operation in Singapore already.
Yeah. So how much of this, we've got another slide, because this sort of conversation made us think about what are the longest routes being operated and where there's hubs being bypassed. So we know that there's still talk of a Project Sunrise. This chart here shows the 8 longest routes being operated this month. But is hub bypass about the long routes and the ultra long haul, or is it the A321 XLR? Is that going to change? That's going to make more difference in terms of how we fly and what sort of origin destination pairs are flown?
The answer is both. They're both going to, have revolutionise some of the routes we see and how they're operated. When you think about Sydney Heathrow non-stop, for the corporate traveller, as I was saying this morning, whereas now you have to leave Sydney middle of the afternoon to catch a flight to Heathrow that gets in at 7 o'clock in the morning, you can probably finish the whole business day in Sydney, crash out on an aeroplane, and wake up at the same time 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning in Heathrow. That's a powerful, message and product proposition to that corporate market that's going back and forth. And I also think the XLR long range 320 and the Max are in their own way going to make some significant changes. But it's also going to be about the configuration of these aircraft and getting the configuration of these aircraft right. If there is going to be a business cabin, and there has to be, because there's got to be corporate demand and they're going to have to fill it. What they don't want is a large economy cabin. They need a large premium economy product, because on a per square foot basis, some airlines are getting multiples of 5 or 6 times what they're getting on economy class in a premium cabin. And I think the one airline CFO pre-COVID was saying that premium economy was his most profitable cabin on his network. So it's about the product mix as much as anything else, Becca.
And in normal circumstances, we'd be very concerned about the rising fuel price. But are these aircraft, the new ones, are so much more efficient that that's less of a worry? I mean, I suppose I'm asking, could the oil price put paid to Project Sunrise? Is that a possibility?
No, because it's going to happen. These aircraft are very efficient, amazing flexibility. I don't think, Project Sunrise is emotional, no doubt about that. It's iconic, and it's something that Qantas have promised to deliver for a long time, and I think they're going to do it.
And I think for the Aussies and for the Europeans who would be benefiting from this direct flight, it's a tangible improvement in their ability to do the trip, to move from that laborious 24-hour trip to this single flight option is going to inspire people to use it. And at the same time, what you said earlier, Becca, is quite right. I mean, in the past, the A345s flying from Singapore to New York was killed off in the last price increase period for oil by Singapore Airlines. was a disaster for them, and those aircraft couldn't make those ultra long haul routes work. The current technology, I think, can.
But and Singapore are coming back into do a double daily Singapore San Francisco, I think, with a A350 operation.
Yeah,
shortly.
and the economics must look so much better.
Yeah, absolutely. The economics look good. I think there's also some really interesting things here, Becca. You know, I know we're looking at the longest routes, but who would have thought that there would be a non-stop Bangalore, San Francisco? And, you know, that whole market is IT and tech and front end, or traditionally front end corporate travel. And it just goes to show that sometimes, you know, markets that are very, very specific can be operated. And clearly, United probably got a lot of pressure from Google and all of those IT companies in Silicon Valley to get in there and give them a direct service.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that makes sense, and I guess that goes to your point about having the right cabin classes as well to meet the travelling the target market that you've got there.
Yeah,
it'll be interesting to see how the 321 XLR is going to impact the medium haul low cost element as well. When you see how many XLRs are on order books for low cost carriers, there's some special things to come there, both in Asia and in Europe and the US. So it's not just a legacy airlines looking at this element, and I don't think it's just going to be transatlantic where there has been this type of activity before the pandemic. Asia is going to be right for it.
Where do you think the option is for disruption there by the low cost carriers?
Middle East. I would wager that Wizz Abu Dhabi will at some point scale up, you know, and they'll be getting as far into Southeast Asia as they possibly can and giving one-stop connectivity back into Northern Europe at ridiculous prices. We had someone recently who found a fare with Wizz Air on a one-stop service to Abu Dhabi, connecting through Central Europe for £60 one way.
Yeah.
Yep, I agree, and that connection into Southeast Asia with those aircraft is a fantastic proposition, potential for Wizz and others who then move into that aircraft type.
And if they ever did, you know, venture to create an equivalent Wizz in Indonesia or in Malaysia, then you're potentially looking at what was the traditional way of getting from Europe to Australia with a two-stop service. A low-cost airline could probably put that in the market for £120.
Yeah, and I mean they've tried this in the past, and with the terrible equipment that no way could make it work. And so yeah, I think you're right. Watch out for those Southeast Asian low costs as they bring on that new equipment.
Yeah,
and maybe even the Korean.
Even the Caribbean, did you say?
Yeah, I think some of the innovations coming out of North Asian low costs are going to be looking at how they do some real new services into Europe and potentially even to the US.
Very exciting. Okay, that's let's move on. We've got one more slide left, so we're actually running a bit ahead today rather than over, which is what we normally do. This just comes back to the point that Mikko was making in the webinar last month, where he was talking about Finnair moving into Stockholm, something they'd thought about before, but never, I guess, quite had the courage to do. So they're operating a number of long-haul services using their A380s, A350s. We know that they can't fly to China as much as they were, and so there's A350s that this is probably a good use of those. But it's interesting, isn't it? For, you know, Stockholm would normally be, it's not the main intercontinental hub for SAS. That would be Copenhagen, I think. So it's an interesting move, isn't it? Is this just opportunistic, John?
Opportunistic, but if it works, they'll stick in it. It's, you know, it's equally a bit of mischief and a bit of disruption. They've got plenty of wide body capacity at the moment. So why not give it a go? These are markets that they can tag into with some of their partners. You know, JFK and Miami, they'll be code sharing and part of a joint venture probably with, well, they are with American Airlines. So you know, that all makes sense as well. So there'll be feeder traffic being generated. It's as we said right at the beginning, Becca, there has never been a better time to experiment. And if you were going to experiment in Scandinavia as Finnair, this is probably the moment and the best place to be doing it in Stockholm.
Yeah.
And by being able to take on SAS, while SAS are in some disarray themselves, having said that, they've got A321 XLRs just coming online now as well. I think they've just announced Toronto as one of their first destinations with the XLR. But I also see that Finnair, the CEO of Finnair, just said the other day that they are waiting for Asian opportunities to get back into Asia and get back to what they've done so well over the last 10 years, bringing Asian traffic through their hub and connecting them down into Europe and across to the US. And they're nimble enough to do it. As you said, John, they've got capacity that's being underutilized at the moment, and he's confirmed that they're ready to activate quickly into probably different Asian points than they've been to in the past. They've always been quite selective on their Asian connecting markets, particularly, of course, they've done very well in China in the past, but other markets now seem to be very much on their horizon.
Yeah, I mean, they will, you know, geography is hugely important in the airline industry. And, you know, the Great Circle route down or over Helsinki, the connecting product there into some of those secondary Chinese markets was a unique proposition that afforded them an opportunity to operate that others just couldn't make work, and work really successfully. And they will want to get back to that as soon as possible. But, you know, 3 years ago, their CEO was saying we want to serve every Asian destination twice daily. And the best they can probably hope for in the next year and a half is to get back to once daily on most of those markets if they can. And that's going to leave them with spare capacity to carry on doing JFKs and Miamis. And you know what, if they work back, it wouldn't be difficult to find aircraft to continue operating them.
I think they're on 3 CEOs since then, though.
Yeah, the life of a CEO in Scandinavia can be quite quick.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all really interesting. We've been able to take quite a few of your questions as we go through, so I think we'll bring the webinar to an end here. But John, Peter, have you any final thoughts on this sort of topic of airline strategies and how they're adapting through this difficult time?
Becca, I think it's really fascinating. I mean, you know, in all of this pandemic, the whole, and it was a flippant sort of throwaway thing, wasn't it? You know, in adversity is opportunity. And yeah, there actually is lots of opportunity, and people have been moving and working very hard and being creative to make things happen. And now we're beginning to see the fruition of that. You know, we've got some of the old stuff coming back. We've got these new opportunities, new technology coming into the market, all that pent up demand. It's a really exciting time. And I think this summer is going to be great for the airline industry. If we can get the price down and people can stop worrying about the price of oil because of other events, then I think, you know, it bodes well.
Right. And Peter, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, very similar issues. It just strikes me that the opportunities that we're going to get out of this terrible COVID couple of years as we move into an endemic rather than pandemic environment, because it's going to be with us for forever pretty much, is those airlines that have got this strong balance sheet and they've got liquidity that can give them some flexibility, like the Wizz Airs, the Ryanairs of the world, where they're quite independent. They're not so beholden to their governments, to what they do with their liquidity, has given them the ability to innovate. And the consumer is very much recognized now, I think even more so in their thinking on their network planning. How are they going to get the people to fly with them? And you know, they've been able to take advantage, those ones with good balance sheets, of airline collapses from the slow-moving legacy carriers. They've been more nimble around the government uncertainty as to entry requirements. So I think that that the incentives provided by airports have got a sharper edge to them now, as they know that airlines are prepared to consider almost any type of new route within certain bounds. So very exciting times.
Yeah, definitely. What I'm hearing from you both is that there are airlines that just have been more agile and more nimble, and some of those are doing, going to come out of this really quite well, and there are others that have been less nimble, less agile, and it's going to remain a tougher time for some of those. But this summer should be good. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, both of you, for your contribution and your insights. Always good to hear from both of you. Our next webinar will be on Wednesday, the 16th of March, and we look forward to you joining us then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Many thanks.
Thank you.